Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the late July edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we'll talk about climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I am Chip Conrad, and I'm the director of the NOAA Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a weather and climate overview. Our regular speakers for today are Jeff Dober from the National Weather Service Southeast River Forecast Center, who will be providing a water resources overview, and Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will give an agricultural impact update. And we are also going to be joined by our special guest today, Dan Wiltsey from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, who will discuss harmful algal blooms in the Southeast. We thank everyone for joining us today. Just a reminder before we begin to type in your questions and comments in the question box, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. Also, an email with a YouTube link to the recording, as well as a summary of today's webinar, will be sent out in the next day or two. Next. Okay, so first off, let's go through just sort of a rundown of what's happened over the last 4 weeks to month. Next. Okay, so here we see a map here of temperatures, and we see a lot of variability here across the Southeast. Obviously, the red colors is where the temperatures were most above normal, and we see that while there's a lot of variability, the warmest temperatures were observed in the very western parts of the Southeast. So Alabama, Northwest Georgia, Western North Carolina, also some areas of central and southern Florida, and you can see a few other pockets around there. Across Puerto Rico, temperatures were very, very close to normal. Next. Now, this time of the year is, of course, when we experience the warmest temperatures, and this map here, courtesy of Jan Knoll from the Golden State Weather, shows basically the date on average. So if we look back at the last, and I believe this is the last 20 years or so, it shows what day on average do you see the warmest temperatures. And across the Southeast, we see some interesting variability. In the northern parts, say across Virginia and much of North Carolina, that occurs in mid-July. As we go into South Carolina and Georgia and parts of Alabama, that's more like late July. And then in the very western areas of portions of Alabama going in towards Mississippi and then going down to central and South Florida, the maximums are not observed until basically early August. Next. And so looking at precipitation here, what we see is what we call a sort of a measly pattern, much variability in precipitation, with some areas getting well above normal precipitation and other areas really getting a real deficit of precipitation. And if there's really any kind of real pattern we can see, and if I were to expand this out, we know there's a lot of dryness out west, and some of that's really extended into parts of the lower and middle Mississippi River Valley, and a bit of that goes into Alabama. Also, it's noteworthy that South Florida and southeastern Florida are much below normal, and also parts of central Virginia. Puerto Rico precipitation was a little bit above normal for this month, which is really good to see because they've been dry for a long time. Next slide. Okay, so we have seen a real change in the precipitation regime over the last 2 months. So when we reported a month ago, you can see here with the map panel to the left that precipitation over much of the region was well below normal. One exception you can see down there was in South Florida. And so we're dealing with some serious drought, which I'll get into in a second, a month ago. Well, over the last month, a lot of areas have gotten a lot more precipitation. And so you can see the change there. But I want to emphasize there's still areas in the Southeast that are still quite dry. Next slide. So this is a map here that shows the ranks of the precipitation and basically for the last month, ending a few days ago. And I just put this in here basically to illustrate that there's a lot of station-to-station variability and how wet it's been. And so you can see the greens there indicating stations that have been in the top 10 in terms of their precipitation record for the last 30 days or so. And then there's a number of brown stations, some of them very high, ranked in the top 4, 5, or 6. A lot of those, again, in North Georgia, extreme western North Carolina, and parts of Alabama. Next slide. Okay, so this is the month in which we really see well, really June and July, a peak, and at least in terms of the frequency of severe thunderstorms. And so we see the climatological map there on the left, and then we look and we see just the count of severe thunderstorm warnings by National Weather Service basically National Weather Service offices there on the left, and you see the pattern lines up very well. So we're pretty close to the climatological average in terms of at least the pattern in terms of the issuance there of warnings. And so generally we see from Northern Virginia, Western North Carolina, upstate of South Carolina, and North Georgia. That's the area that saw the highest number of severe thunderstorms. Next. Okay, so this is also the big peak in terms of lightning strikes. And so I point your attention to the upper right there. And so you see the map there of lightning fatalities. And you can see there that the peak is very much in July, followed by June, and followed by August. And unfortunately for the Southeast, that's where we tend to see the most lightning strikes, according to the map there that you see there in the bottom right. And this year, very sadly, and really in the last month, 5 out of 7 of the lightning fatalities for the entire country have occurred in parts of the Southeast. And just a quick scan there, you look at the demographics there, basically all of the lightning strike victims were all male. So it very much correlates highly with outdoor labor. Next slide. Okay, so we just had one tropical storm, kind of a surprise one a bit, named Colin, and basically this system formed very close to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, just south of Myrtle Beach, near Georgetown, and it basically moved just inland of the coast. Moved very slowly. It was a very minimal system. Wind speeds maxed out at 40 miles an hour. It was a small system, and it didn't produce that much rain. Next. Now, just going ahead and looking at the outlook here for the next 5 to 7 days, or at least the next 2 days, there's not any systems that they're currently looking at out there that could develop into tropical cyclones. And as probably a lot of you know, tropical cyclone means that it would be a tropical storm or a hurricane, so basically a named system. Next. And so this chart here shows the frequency of tropical systems, tropical cyclones by the day of the year. And I put this in here to emphasize that while we've only had one system here over the last 4 weeks or so, that's very close to the climatological norm. Okay. And when Colin being the sea storm, if we look at it on average, that would occur around August 3rd. So what I'm saying here is that we're still ahead in terms of the number of systems we've experienced this year. We're most certainly in a lull right now, but if we look at it climatologically, we should expect to see a big uptick in the number of systems as we get into August, and especially as we're getting very close to September. So you can see in the diagram that the vast majority of systems form basically from mid-August up until early to mid-October. So we're not even close to the really active part of the season yet. And in terms of hurricanes, on average, we would expect the first hurricane to occur anywhere in the Atlantic Basin around the 11th of August on average. Next. Okay, so taking a look at basically El Nino and La Niña, I just want to, there's a lot of information here, but I just want to point out here, we've been in La Niña conditions, pretty strong La Niña conditions, and there's been a little bit of a weakening, but the models there that you see on the right are kind of pointing to the possibility of basically what we call a triple dip. So in terms of sea surface temperature in the equatorial Pacific. So what that suggests is that La Niña conditions are expected to intensify a little bit here in the coming weeks. And as we follow basically the blue bars there, as we go into the winter, those conditions are expected to decrease, and we're expected to see a greater and greater probability of us going into neutral conditions there. This obviously does not bode well in terms of hurricane activity, because we know there's a positive association between the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin and La Niña occurrences in the equatorial Pacific. Next. Okay, so moving over to the Drought Monitor, just a real quick peek here across the country. We've heard a lot about the horrible droughts that are occurring in Texas and much of the western U.S. We're just seeing remnants of drought left in the eastern or in the southeastern US. Next slide. And so we've seen a really marked improvement. And so what you can see there is that we still have some areas of D2 or severe drought and small portions of Southside Virginia, eastern North Carolina, little bits of extreme southern South Carolina, and around the Savannah area of Georgia, a little bit of upstate or really northwest Georgia. So it's very much in pockets, and of course this corresponds to this sort of measles pattern of precipitation that we typically experience this time of the year. And so we're all familiar with it. We get afternoon and evening thunderstorms that drop a lot of rain in one place and not much rain in other places. One thing that we've had, some areas have had the benefit of this year is we've had more cold fronts than average that have swept down from the northwest, and then they basically parked themselves either in Virginia or usually in the Carolinas. And so that's provided a focusing point for some of the thunderstorms. But again, the rain that occurs with these storms is very localized, and there's areas in between, unfortunately, that don't get very much precipitation. Now, looking real quickly over at the lawn and garden moisture index there on the right, you can see, again, a lot of variation. And if you look closely at the pattern, you see areas that are still, by the Drought Monitor, identified in severe drought, but they look pretty green here. And this simply indicates that recently, these areas, particularly along the coast of North Carolina, have gotten more rain, but we're still dealing with some soil moisture deficits and low stream flow and that sort of thing there. Next slide. Okay, in terms of the drought outlook here, not really much change. If we look across the southeast, we don't see hardly any coloration. Where there is coloration, and these are just a few areas in which drought remains, it's expected basically to remain or basically to get better. One exception, of course, would be northwestern Alabama, northern Mississippi, and that's the area that basically expands out to the west where the drought is expected to persist. In terms of soil moisture, we're expecting it to start to improve later as we go into the fall, and this relates probably to the expected higher than normal probability of seeing tropical systems. And one thing I'll say about tropical systems too is, we're really concerned about them in terms of wind and flooding and so forth, but in a lot of cases, weakened tropical systems, if they're moving at a pretty good clip, can really help restore soil moisture, because without those tropical systems, very much as we get into September and October, they're very much the driest months of the year. So what we might be hopeful for is that we have a number of systems, but they're weak. We don't get hardly any flooding, we hardly get any wind. Next slide. And so in terms of the 3-month outlook, temperatures across the area are expected to pretty much remain above normal. Seasonal precipitation over much of the area, with exception to western North Carolina, northwest Georgia, and northern Alabama, the probabilities are more than 50% that precipitation will be above average. And so that probability is the greatest in eastern North Carolina and eastern portions of Virginia. And some of this forecast, again, is related to the fact that we're probably going to see more tropical systems than average. Next slide. Okay, and in terms of the 6 to 10 day outlook, temperatures above normal here, again, across the region. And then if we look at precipitation, there's a higher probability of getting above normal precipitation across a broad swath of the northern part of our area. So western Virginia, western North Carolina, and the very northern parts of Georgia and also Alabama there. Next slide. And so for the rest of the week, well, we have a front that's going to sag down over the weekend and get very close to the northern parts of our area. And so quite a bit of precipitation is forecasted for the next 7 days. Again, this is going to be very much hit and miss. And so so really it's something that's very, very difficult to forecast. Next. Okay, so just a quick recap. So in terms of recent temperature and precipitation, so temperatures have been above average over much of the area, and then we've had basically normal to slightly below normal temperatures across small parts of central and southern South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Precipitation generally average out across the region has been wetter, and that's been very fortunate, but there's also been much variation, which is typical of this month. And it's also remarkable that it's been especially dry in northern Alabama, southeast Florida, and central Virginia. Mentioned there again, Tropical Storm Colin, who really didn't have much influence at all. Drought basically marked improvements in many areas. And then just going into the outlook here, so for the next couple of weeks here, July 20th to August 3rd, likely warmer than normal across Florida, southeast Alabama, central and southern Georgia, central and eastern South Carolina, and southeast North Carolina and southern Florida. This time of the year, there's a lot of variation, okay? But basically, we're leaning towards warmer than normal temperatures across much of the region. Precipitation is leaning towards being above normal for most of the region, except southern portions of South Carolina and Georgia, southeastern South Carolina and Florida. Over the next 3 months, likely warmer than normal and then leaning to wetter than normal through the region, except northern Alabama and northwest Georgia, where there's equal chances of wetter or drier conditions there. Next. Okay, thank you very much. And so we're going to turn it over here now to Jeff Dober, who's going to give us a water resources overview.
Alrighty, thank you, Chip. And we're going to do our late summer autumn flood outlook here. We'll go to the next slide and we'll show you what's going on currently across the Southeast. In general, for the most part, we're seeing near normal stream flows across most of the Southeast. There's a small exception there in Southern Virginia in the Chewan River Basin and parts of the Roanoke River Basin. But for the most part, near normal, and we see the 28-day average runoff. That's our 28-day hydrograph across the region. In general, we're treading there in the below normal to normal range as we go into typically what is the lowest period of stream flows during this time of season. Go to the next slide and we'll look at the individual state-by-state stream flow graphs. And for the most part, as we've been calling for over the last several calls, stream flows are running in the near normal range for the most part. We see there in Alabama, the black line following mostly in that green range, meaning near normal. For Georgia, the 28-day average there, we see treading right in that orange to green range, meaning slightly below normal to normal range as we move into the, as I said before, the typical lower stream flow period of the year. And then we see in Florida, again, in the normal range. Going eastward into the Carolinas, we go to the next slide. And we see more of the same here, South Carolina, North Carolina. You know, we did have that drier period there in May and June where we were seeing below normal stream flows, but the recent rainfall has jumped stream flows back up into the normal range for South Carolina, as well as North Carolina. Again, treading in that, we've been pretty variable in that normal to below normal range. And then same with Virginia, near normal range. Going to the next slide, and we'll show you our current conditions, flood conditions, and pretty typical this time of year. All green squares here showing almost all rivers are below flood levels and below our bankful levels. We have a few points there in the Florida Panhandle, a few of the smaller coastal rivers in southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle there, near bankful with some recent locally heavy thunderstorms over the last week. But for the most part, we're below flood across most of the Southeast at the current time, which is pretty typical. Going to the next slide, and we'll show you our river flood climatology here. We're in week 30. Again, this is a lull period for river flooding in the Southeast in general. It doesn't really start picking up till September. September is really where we start to see the active tropical season activity, but should be relatively quiet till then. Go to the next slide. The only exception to this is typically South Florida, Central Florida, Tampa area, a lot of the smaller coastal rivers there. We'll typically start to see a ramp up with the wet season. We haven't seen that as bad as typically down in that area. We haven't really seen much flooding. Those stream flows are running near normal to some pockets above normal. So we'll see this, usually a threat of flooding increases as we go into the tropical season down there across South and Central Florida and the Florida Peninsula. We'll go on to the next slide. And we'll follow that up here with our late summer and early autumn flood prediction or flood outlook for August, September, and October. You can see, and we're calling for near normal risk of river flooding. Again, we're in our low season period. Usually stream flows or flooding in the interior southeast doesn't pick up till November and the late fall and into the winter season. So we're in our low season risk for the interior, but near normal risk for river flooding in the Florida Peninsula, which this is their high season risk. And especially as we go into September, that is usually when we start to see not only the tropical storm activity start to have a higher risk across the southeast, especially the Florida Peninsula, but also we see cold fronts that make their way through the southeast and sort of stall down across central Florida and act as a focus for heavy rainfall. Those two are typically what brings us our risk in the Florida Peninsula as we go into the latter summer and early fall period. So in summary, we go to the final slide here for our stream flows. And again, 28-day stream flows across the southeast are near normal, with the exception of the southern Virginia there, the Schwann River Basin, where we're seeing below normal stream flows. Stream flows are typically fall off this time of year, and this is our lull period, with the exception of the Florida Peninsula. And as far as expectations, we'll see stream flows that continue to be in that mostly in the below normal or normal range. That'll be variable probably until we get into September. And then the big caveat is, of course, the tropical systems. Below normal stream flow will be more likely if the tropical activity does not impact the southeast. That's always the big variable as we go into the month of September for the southeast. So overall flooding will be typical, which means low chance for the interior southeast, but an increased risk across the Florida Peninsula. And that's all I had as far as the southeast rivers. I'll pass it on to Pam.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and welcome everybody. I see we have almost 200 people online this morning, which is amazing. Glad to have you all here. I'm Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, and let's jump right in on the next slide. Chip has shown this a little bit already. This is the temperature rankings for the last 30 days, I believe, for temperature on the left and for precipitation on the right. And you can see that there's pockets where temperatures have ranked in the top 5 for a lot of Florida, at least the Florida Peninsula, and some of the areas near the Appalachian Mountains. Precipitation also has been very high, ranked across many parts of the area in the top 5 wettest. One of the interesting exceptions, I think, is the east coast of Florida, which has really missed a lot of the rain this year and is ranked near the driest. I've got a couple of friends in Miami who've been talking about how little rain they've gotten in the last month. And so things have generally improved quite a bit. Chip talked about a change in the pattern. It's almost as if somebody clicked a light and all of a sudden we started getting all this rain back. And that has been a real benefit for the farmers. And I can certainly tell it because I'm getting a lot less emails and phone calls than I was a month ago. And so I guess from my perspective, that's a good thing. And for most of the farmers, I think as well. So if we move on to the next slide, this just shows a couple different perspectives of soil temperature and soil moisture. On the left is the soil temperature, the top 10 centimeters of the soil profile. And you can see that for most of the region, we're pretty close to normal, even in spite of the warm temperatures. And that's because we've had so much more rain that a lot of the energy that's coming from the sun is now going towards evaporation rather than towards heating the soil. And some areas actually have had so much rain that they're a little bit below normal in soil temperatures. And that's good because the really high temperatures does put stress on the crops. So we're happy to see that. And then on the right-hand side, soil moisture, the top 20 centimeters, shows pretty close to normal, very spotty, measly pattern, I think is what Chip said, of some areas that have gotten a lot of rain and other areas that haven't. it's always the people in the areas that haven't that are the ones that call me or write me. And you can see drier conditions down there in the Florida Peninsula, as well as the eastern part of North Carolina and quite a bit of Virginia. But overall, things are looking pretty good, and most farmers, I think, are pretty happy with that, especially after the dry start to the growing season. If we go on, you can see some of the impacts of recent conditions on agriculture. The switch to the wetter conditions has really led to big increases in fungal diseases of corn, peanuts, and other crops. And so there's been many, many examples of that. The picture on the left there shows aspergillus mold, which is basically creating aflatoxins in the corn, something that obviously the producers do not want to see. Now, most of the corn is kind of past the point where they're going to see yield losses from the fungal diseases, but some of the other crops definitely will. So farmers really need to keep on top of managing the diseases with pesticides and other crop management techniques. Another good thing that we've seen is that with the addition of the rain, the pastures have started to grow again. The forage producers are very happy about that, the livestock producers, because they were really having to feed a lot of hay, and this time of year they don't have a lot left after the winter. And so the bad part of that is that the fields are often so wet that they can't cut for hay right now, and so they're having to look for those dry spots between the wet spells. And with the spotty rain conditions we have this year, that can be sometimes hard. We also note that the wet conditions have made it hard for some farmers to get into the fields to apply that fungicide. So they're really looking for those windows to open up so they can get in and take care of their crops. Some of the farmers are now starting to plant second crops. They're planting soybean after corn, hoping that we'll have a good fall season so that they can get those crops completed before it gets too cold. But if they're not, they're starting to mow and plant cover crops so that they can really reduce the population of pathogens and weeds going into the next growing season. And it's obviously not too early to think about that for most farmers. If we go on, I just wanted to mention the condition monitoring reports, or the CMOR reports. These are just the ones that have come in since the last meeting, or the last webinar that we've given. You might remember from last month, if you were on, that Georgia really had a lot of reports, and you can see that has continued. I post in my blog how to do this, and I think that probably has gotten some attention, especially the livestock producers there in the areas just to the east of Atlanta, where they're having a lot of problems with forage. If you look at just the last week, there's only been a few reports, and so most people now are in much better shape than they have been. If you are in one of the other states that doesn't have very many reports, I encourage you to go and take a look and maybe put in a monitoring report. You don't have to be in drought. You can report wet conditions as well. That's very helpful to the Drought Monitor authors. And so something that's definitely useful. I don't know what's going on down in northwest Arkansas. Clearly they're in more drought than we are, but they're getting all kinds of reports. So somebody there must really be encouraging folks to turn in those reports in other parts of the country as well. If we go on to the next slide, if we look at just the next few weeks, Chip talked about this a little bit already. We do expect this pattern of scattered rain showers. Some areas could get several inches in the next couple of weeks, but there's certainly going to be other areas that get missed by that. And you can see on the rainfall map, that's a 2-week rainfall, I think, for the southeast, and you can see that area that's going to get wet this week, which Chip showed in an earlier graph. Other areas will get less, but most areas are expected to get maybe at least an inch of rain in most places, which will be great. And I did look at the day-to-day outlooks, and it does look like there's going to be some scattered periods of dry weather. And so that may help the hay producers to get their crops in and to the fungicide to be applied effectively. We do expect to see warmer than normal conditions in the next 4 weeks. And really, if you look ahead in time, it really could continue almost through the fall into winter. That's partly because of the way the weather patterns are, and partly because of the long-term trends in warmer temperatures that we're seeing across the country. The long-range models are really not showing any significant tropical activity in our area really in the next 2 weeks. Chip only talked about the next week or so. There's a big plume of dust that's coming off of Africa right now, and that usually tends to suppress any development. there's a few little signs that there might be some weak waves on the south edge of that. They'd be a long ways away and probably not too likely to develop. So I think there's not a lot to worry about as far as tropical activity in our area. Of course, the Gulf is warm. It's possible that a remnant of a front or something could spin up a little storm there, but we're not really seeing anything at this point. And then, of course, as Chip mentioned, the La Niña conditions that we expect to continue could mean another warm and dry winter. And that's important for agriculture because that means that you can have overwintering of diseases. We saw that this past year, whereas some areas didn't get frost until almost the end of January. And so there were a lot of places that fungal diseases and some insect pests could hide and not get frozen out. So that's something to really think about for next year. If you're planning ahead to next year's crops, you want to consider treating as you put the seed in the ground, because once it goes in the ground and you close the furrow, there's not necessarily a lot you can do with some of those diseases. So that's something to just think about in the months ahead. If we go on, here's my summary of the impacts. We've seen the improvement in drought that Chip talked about due to the change to a wetter weather pattern. The rain and the high humidity and also the clouds has greatly increased the incidence of fungal diseases, and so farmers are really having to go after those. Next few weeks, continued warm periods, continuation of the rainier conditions, but there's going to be some dry openings for people to get field work done. And then no sign of activity in the tropics for at least the next couple weeks. But sea surface temperatures are warm, so once it does start to become active, we could see a bunch of storms develop relatively quickly, and that goes in line with what Jeff talked about with and Chip talked about with the increase in the tropical season as we go towards the end of August. And then La Niña continuation may mean another warm and dry winter ahead. I appreciate your attention, and it's now my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker for today. Dan Wiltsey of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality is going to talk about harmful algal blooms in the southeast. So take it away, Dan.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Pam mentioned, my name is Dan Wiltsey. I'm the Algal Bloom Response Coordinator for the North Carolina Division of Water Resources within the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And this morning I'm going to be talking about harmful algal blooms in the southeast. Next slide, please. So before we go into blooms, I just wanted to take a step back and go over what algae are. So algae is kind of a catch-all term for these large group of photosynthetic organisms. They're found in all water bodies. They form the base of all aquatic food webs. There are many different groups. You can see in this picture on the right, there are 4 different groups here. These are not all the groups of algae that there are, and the images shown aren't the only genera and species of algae in those groups, but it just goes to show the wide range that these algae can show. And I've highlighted this specific group in the bottom right, the blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, because these are the algae that are becoming more and more common here in North Carolina and the Southeast, as well as across the world. And so, as I mentioned, algae are important organisms in the aquatic environment, but under certain environmental conditions, they can increase have rapid growth and lead to what are known as blooms. And some of these conditions include excess nutrients in the water, including nitrogen and phosphorus, which is the one way that we can control blooms, is controlling the amount of nutrients that are entering the water body. But some of the more environmental and climatic impacts that can lead to blooms are warmer temperatures, extended sunlight, as well as low water flow. And so because of that, a lot of these blooms tend to occur during the summertime when these conditions are more common. Next slide, please. The slide shows some of the more common cyanobacteria that we see here in North Carolina under the microscope. It's not important to know what these organisms are or remember their names or anything, but what I want you to take away from this is just the fact that they look very different under the microscope, and that difference in morphology can lead to different roles in the environment. Next slide. And so we looked at what they look like under the microscope, but everyone's always more concerned of obviously what they look like, you know, macroscopically with the eye and the environment. And so blooms can manifest in different ways in the environment. A lot of the times they can look what's referred to as spilled paint on the surface of the water. A lot of the times they can be within the actual water column, which makes the entire water body take on this kind of green shade. The bottom middle picture shows what are referred to as grass clippings. So these are just accumulations of algal cells clumped together. They can also form these thick filamentous mats that can float on the surface of the water that you can see in the bottom right. So obviously these organisms, you know, when they bloom, they can cause not only, you know, aesthetic impacts, it can lead to impacts to recreation and tourism. It can lead to taste and odor compounds. A lot of the times the algae can decrease the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water that can lead to fish kills. When there is a bloom on the surface of the water, it can block out sunlight to the bottom of a water body and can choke out other submerged aquatic vegetation. So these bloom events are, you know, very detrimental to the environment that they occur in. Next slide, please. And so one of the other concerns that we have with blooms are cyanotoxins. And so these are toxins that are produced by cyanobacteria. They have different health effects, including some can affect the liver, nervous system, cell function. I have 4 different types of cyanotoxins shown here on the screen. Currently, DWR, we can only test for the one toxin. We only have the resources to test for microcystin, highlighted in the top right there. But this is one of the most common and well-studied cyanotoxins that are out there. The field of toxin research is really interesting right now because one genera can produce multiple toxins. So if it's a potential toxin producer and you find it in your environment, a lot of the times they can produce more than one of these. But the presence of these toxic species in your water body does not necessarily mean that toxins are present. So a lot of the times these organisms produce these toxins in response to different things, and there's a lot of research going on right now as to figuring out when they produce them and why. So just because you have a potentially toxic species in your water body doesn't mean that there are toxins present. And the other thing is that there are water treatment plants have very robust methods in place to help take the toxins and algae out of the water before it goes out to homes and businesses. Next slide, please. This slide shows just a quick conceptual map of what happens when we receive a bloom report in here at DWR. So the first thing is that we'll get a report in from either a citizen or one of our staff members out during routine monitoring, comes across a bloom, for example. Our staff, if they're available, will go out, collect a sample, bring it in, ship it into our central lab here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll analyze it, look under the microscope, do toxin testing on it if necessary, interpret that data, write up a final report and distribute it. And if necessary, follow up in that water body by going back and collecting more samples. Next slide, please. And so there are a few different ways that folks can get in contact with us. In the past, that's usually been either a phone call or an email, either into us here at the central lab or to one of our regional offices located across the state. But recently, a couple years ago, we developed this online algal bloom reporting form and dashboard. And it was developed to allow citizens to easily report and track events across the state. There are 2 components to it. The first is a citizen reporting form. I have the websites for both here. You can also find them if you just search on Google for NCDEQ algal blooms. We have the links on our website. On the right, I have a screenshot of what the reporting form is. It's just a short form that allows folks to say when and where they saw a bloom. Once this report is submitted, it will send an email to us and alert us that the report came in. And it will also populate onto our dashboard. And so I have the link for that as well. It's an ArcGIS website. Citizens can log on to that, see where blooms have occurred across the state, and get information from those reports. This was created for replacement for an older version of reporting form and an algal bloom map that we had. Last year in 2021, we had 144 total reports on our dashboard. 95 of those were algal bloom reports. So this reporting system can also be used for algal blooms and fish kills, so that the majority of them were algal bloom reports. And currently on the dashboard, we have about 354 reports on there with 245 algal blooms. That increase is not necessarily due to an increased number of separate algal bloom reports. A large portion of those came from one single event in one lake. So I'd be hesitant to say that we've had more algal blooms this year than in the past. We don't have the data yet to back that up. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And so this is just a screenshot of what the dashboard looks like. Oh, go back, please. Right.
Yeah, can you see the dashboard? I can.
Yes, this is right. So this is a screenshot of the algal bloom dashboard. Again, folks can log on to this and see where blooms and fish kill events have occurred across the state. You can either click on a symbol on the map itself or click on one of the reports on the left-hand side. It will bring up a small pop-up window that will show all of the information submitted by the user who submitted the report, as well as our information as our results from our investigation. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to just go through a few examples of blooms that we've had over the past few years and some problem areas that we're aware of. And so the first one is in the Chowan River, which was referenced earlier in this presentation. This is in the northeastern section of North Carolina along the coast. Blooms have been occurring in this area since about 2015, again, mostly during the summertime, during hot, dry periods. At least one bloom per summer during that 8-year period. There were last year at least 14 reports just on the river itself, mostly microcystis and dolichospermum blooms. And again, those are two types of cyanobacteria that we tend to see frequently here in North Carolina. More reports came in on smaller creeks and ponds in the area, as well as reports along the Perquimans, Little and Pasquotank rivers out in that area as well. Samples that were collected in July of last year contained 350 parts per billion of microcystin. And again, that's the one algal toxin that we test for here. Just for reference, the EPA recreational health guidelines for microcystin is only 8 parts per billion. So this was much higher than that. And that led us to issue a press release for that area. We do work closely with North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services whenever toxins are present or a large bloom like this is in a heavily recreated area that can impact a lot of folks. So we do have health individuals working with us whenever these blooms occur. And we also collaborate with the Chowan-Edenton Environmental Group out in this area. They're kind of our eyes and ears on the ground, you know, looking to see when these blooms are occurring and making us aware of them. And that just really highlights the importance of citizen scientists with bloom reports, because, you know, we can't be everywhere all at once with our staff. And so having folks out there being able to tell us when blooms are occurring is incredibly helpful to us. Next slide, please. So Lake Wylie is a lake that is located on the North Carolina-South Carolina border, south of Charlotte. Historically, there have been no bloom issues in this location, but last, I believe, August or so, there was bloom reports that started to come in on both sides of the lake, again, dominated by cyanobacteria, including microcystis and cylindrospermopsis. We collected some samples. We did not detect any toxins with our samples, but South Carolina was out there and did detect microcystin at greater than 10 parts per billion. And this event just really created this great collaborative stakeholders group that's still going on, working on, trying to figure out the best way to warn folks and be able to sample and analyze the samples from this lake. Some of the groups included in that group are the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, Duke Energy, the River Keepers, North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. I think there are a couple more that have joined since, local health departments, but it just really shows how much researchers and folks involved are coming together and working on these issues collaboratively. Next slide, please. And finally, I just wanted to go over Lake Gaston. This is a large lake on the North Carolina and Virginia border. This has had historic hydrilla issues in the past, which is a nuisance aquatic weed. Successful management over the past several years have led to decreased hydrilla in that environment, but that has led Microcera to increase in that area. And so Microcera woolii is formerly known as Lingbia. It's also known as black mat algae. You can see that in the picture on the right here. This is a benthic algae that forms thick, smelly mats that can float to the surface and are difficult to manage just due to its thick, filamentous nature. A lot of the research right now has been going towards benthic algae. In the past, it's been focused on the phytoplankton, that what we've mostly been talking about through this presentation, that free-floating algae in the water column. So there's not a lot of research on this benthic algae right now, but like I said, a lot of research has been going into this over the past couple of years. And so our internal aquatic weed program, as well as academic researchers, including those at NC State, as well as Old Dominion, other state agencies, both here in North Carolina and Virginia, are again working collaboratively to try to figure out ways to work on these Microcera issues. Next slide, please. And so, the big thing that everyone is concerned about is, what is climate change going to do to these algal blooms? And so I took information from the North Carolina Climate Science Report. This was published back in 2020, and I pulled out some of the relevant facts that or predictions that they stated in this report. And so a couple of things that they said was that it was very likely that temperatures will increase in North Carolina in all seasons. And in fact, June of this year was the driest in more than 30 years, potentially the second driest since 1895. You can see this map in the bottom right shows the drought conditions across the state as of July 5th. And I think it was something close to 90 or maybe 93% of the state at that time was in drought conditions. They also, the Climate Science Report also found that it was very likely that the number of warm and very warm nights will increase, and that it was likely that severe droughts will be more frequent and intense. And if you remember at the beginning, we talked about how increased sunlight and temperatures, low water flow as a result of drought are some of the conditions that can help for these algal blooms to form. And so while our weather here is variable, it makes that difficult for us to link a single event to climate change. It is likely that we'll see the right conditions for bloom formation to continue in the future. And I know EPA, as well as their partners, academic researchers are looking into these questions right now. So I know there's going to be a lot more information on climate change and bloom conditions coming out in the near future. Next slide, please. And quickly, I just wanted to go through kind of what's next for us here for our Algal Bloom program. Just continuing collaborations with other groups on known problem areas, especially some of the ones that we've talked about here. Continuing to do our regular routine and investigate episodic bloom reports. Continuing to promote our reporting system on social media, through newspapers, interviews, presentations, as well as just educating folks on what blooms are and how to protect themselves and their family from it. Working on streamlining our process to the reporting form and dashboard to make it easier for the public and for our staff to use, and then hopefully begin to start understanding yearly trends. We have all this algal data going back, a couple decades. And so trying to put that together to try to figure out where blooms have been increasing or decreasing across the state. Next slide, please. All right, and that's all I had for this, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dan, and all of our speakers. My name is Meredith Muth. I work for NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. We are one of the co-organizers of this webinar series that's been going on for 2 years, along with the Southeast Regional Climate Center and the National Weather Service. Dan, I just want to say I'm really glad you came to present, because even though we oftentimes focus on climate phenomena and some of the more obvious impacts of changes in weather and climate, this is a really great example of how changes in extremes, precipitation, and temperature can really impact water quality, which can then impact ecosystem and human health. And it's a really complicated relationship. So thanks for bringing this to our attention and sharing some experience in North Carolina. And also for highlighting another really cool citizen science project. That was the second one mentioned today, so I thought that was fantastic. I also want to thank all of our speakers, Pam Knox, Jeff Dober, and Chip Conrad. Right now we're going to take some questions. We have a few lined up. Please go ahead, and if you have any other questions or comments, we have quite a few experts on the line here to help answer them. Go ahead. I am going to start right now with a question for Chip. Chip, this is about the 3-month temperature outlook. I don't see easily anywhere on the map showing below normal. We heard scorching heat waves has been affecting many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. I also heard Antarctica, which is in winter now, is experiencing much warmer than normal temperature, getting rain instead of snow. All of these things, do they have anything to do with global warming? Nice question to start our Q&A.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And of course, they're related to global warming. But what we need to keep in mind is there's a lot of natural variability. And, when we're looking at outlooks and so forth, they're going to, they're a bit of a generalized sort of thing. And we're going to see most of the time that temperatures are expected to be above normal. Okay, and so climate change is built into are certainly built into these outlooks, but again, natural variability is built in as well. And we will see times in which temperatures are below normal, and even rare times where temperatures are way below normal, like what was experienced in the Southern Plains the winter before last. So we just need to keep in mind there's still a lot of variability, but definitely the footprint of climate change is very much making itself felt across the world.
Great, thanks, Chip. Our next 3 questions are for Dan. Are local EMA agencies on the investigation report for blooms or fish kills distribution list? So is emergency management receiving this information?
So they're not receiving the bloom reports directly usually. If they do receive them, it's usually on off hours when we're not working or over the weekend. They know to send those reports to us. And we are the main agency that takes care of investigating them. So they're not, again, included directly, but they do, if they get anything, they would just put them directly to us and we'd be the ones investigating.
Okay. Next question, Dan, related to the dashboard, the ArcGIS dashboard you showed, which was really cool. Is there a way to change from viewing North Carolina and view Alabama? Or is this strictly a North Carolina product? And I will say, if it doesn't include Alabama, are you aware of other dashboards similar to this in the Southeast region?
So you're correct. Our dashboard only looks at North Carolina specifically. I don't know about Alabama, but I know, for example, Virginia and South Carolina, who I mentioned we work with quite frequently. I know they do have similar dashboards like this. I know other states across the country also have similar dashboards like that. Again, I don't know if Alabama does directly, but it's possible that they do.
Okay, Dan, how many staff does North Carolina allocate to your program? And what triggers a public notice, public health warning, signage posted, etc.? So 2 different questions there.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. We have just a few staff in our central lab here that deal with analyzing the samples, looking for what type of algae are there. As far as our field staff, we have a few dozen, I would say, across the state in our different regional offices that go out and do the actual investigation, collect the samples for us and everything. As far as what triggers, public notice, anything like that, we are only an environmental program, so we don't deal with the public health side or anything like that. So that's why we bring in DHHS whenever there's a potential public health issue related to these blooms. What happens is that if DHHS determines that, yes, this is a public health concern, they'll reach out to the local health department in that area. And then together, they will work together to determine if any kind of closure or advisory or signage being posted at that area is necessary. And so when it comes to that kind of thing, we aren't involved in the actual closure advisory process. All we are able to say is, we found this particular algae here, if toxins were present or not, and then we will work with them to offer them any sort of guidance. But when it comes to actual closures and those sorts of things, it's usually the local authorities that issue that.
Great, thank you so much. I have another question, and then I'm also going to share in the link. We have someone from Florida who shared their dashboard. So if we have anybody from Alabama who does have a relevant dashboard, that would be great to share it with me. And this might be our time for our last question. Dan, is there one weather lament that causes these blooms, like temperature, overnight temperature, lack of rain, etc.? And is there any weather element that helps get rid of the algal blooms, such as cold temperatures, more rain, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like I mentioned, kind of the main drivers of these blooms are warm temperatures, extended sunlight, low water flow, as well as nutrients being flushed into the system. And so that's kind of the nutrients are the one main thing that we can actually control. So whenever we talk about bloom prevention or management, we always talk about trying to decrease the amount of nutrients that go into the system. The things that can decrease blooms are definitely what was mentioned, cold and rain, especially the cyanobacteria. They, like I mentioned, like warm temperatures. So once it gets colder, they don't bloom as often. Last year, we did have a couple reports of blooms when it was cooler. So they can definitely still bloom if some of the other conditions are right. Definitely storms can help blow, the wind and the rain can help flush blooms out of a system. But the flip side of that is that a lot of times the storms can also cause nutrients from on the land to be flushed into the system. So once the storm comes through, kind of primes that system with all these nutrients. Right after that, if you start to have several days of warm temperatures and increased sunlight, that can also lead to bloom formations then.
Great, thank you, Dan. We're going to wrap this up. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out an email in the next couple days that has the key takeaways and bullets along with the webinar recording to different sections. So it's really easy for you to share. We'll send that out next month. Perfect timing, late August. We've talked about heat a lot. We'll have a presentation from NOAA on climate, heat, and the Southeast. A webinar survey will pop up when you close out. If you haven't taken it before, even if you have, please take a moment and share thoughts on what you would like to hear more about from our special presenters and the focus of this webinar. So thank you for joining us today. And again, a huge thanks to our presenters as always, and have a wonderful day.